much obliged to you for coming this evening. Fortunately, the weather has improved slightly. This evening, ladies and gentlemen, our organiser, Malcolm, has achieved another amazing thing insofar as we were to have Professor Tom Lawton talking about the Church of England's attitude to the Holocaust, and he is unable to be here this evening because it clashed with a degree day at the University of Northumbria, apparently, but we're extremely fortunate that Malcolm has managed to obtain the services of Samuel Brady, who is to talk about Leeds Jewish Disabled, their welfare in the history of the Jewish Board of Guardians, 1870 to 1928. Samuel studied at Leeds University. His studies were concentrating on race history, yes, which exactly explains what you understand it to mean, the history of different races, and obviously particularly in Leeds. However, now he's been called north and he's now reading for an MA at the University of PhD in Glasgow. So we're happy to welcome Samuel, and you will now like to present his talk.
Thank you. Right, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me. Thank you for everything. I should say off the bat that I was lucky enough to actually receive a financial contribution from the Jewish Historical Society, and that was a really small thing just to help with transport costs and costs of taking photos in archives. But off the bat, I should just mention that I was given some money to do it. So yeah, obviously, as I was introduced, I've done a lot of history, thinking about race, about minority groups, but I ended up falling into history of disabled people, and I thought it would be interesting to think about how that intersected with the Jewish community, and I kind of figured, well, I'm in Leeds, so I might as well talk about the Leeds Jewish community while doing that. So the way I'm going to structure this talk is that I'm going to kind of talk about why I decided to pick this topic and what existing historiography exists for the subject matter, and then I'll go through kind of issues I had as I started my research, and then actually into the minutiae of the actual topic that you came to hear me talk about. So in thinking about the history of disabled people and about Jewish disabled people, there are a couple of books which focus on this idea, but they're not necessarily in the right time period, not necessarily in the right focus. There's a really interesting book by Freiherr Schoensteiner, who is Jewish, weirdly, and it's a book on the marginal minority, which looks at disability in Christian and Jewish communities in early medieval Europe. It's a really fascinating book. It's just, obviously it's not much to do with 19th century Jews in Leeds. And there's another interesting article by Sandra Gilman, which thinks about obesity under the Americans with Disabilities Act, because under that act, obesity is thought of as a disability, and how historically disability was actually linked to the Jewish community, kind of in the eugenic thinking of 18th century America. But again, just due to the focus and the narrow focus on obesity, just as that one disability, doesn't actually cover the scope that I wanted to with this research. Generally, when I was looking into Anglo-Jewish history from this time period, I felt that a lot of the histories I was seeing were very... they painted a very generic view of the community. It was the history of Jews from 1656 to 2000, and there was not necessarily any indication of how the lives of women different from the lives of men, how the lives of the disabled different from the able-bodied, of gay people from straight people. So I thought it'd be interesting to think about that and to really bring a different perspective into Jewish histories, especially because this is a very interesting and topical part of Jewish life nowadays. I think one thing I know from my background as being someone with a learning difficulty, coming from a family of people with disabilities, that the community can be a very loving and inclusive place, but also might not necessarily be in certain ways. So going forward, it's something the community also, it's important to think about. And so thinking about it from a historical perspective, it can't hurt anyway. So then you might also wonder why I decided to focus on Leeds. And as I said, it was partially just because I'm here already. and I thought I might as well use the histories of the local community, the archives that are being curated, the things at the University of Leeds and other organisations like the Leeds Jewish Welfare Board to focus on those histories and pull the narrative I wanted to out. But there was also a methodological reason behind it. When I was looking through these histories and I saw a lot of homogenous views of the community, I noticed that a couple of MA theses and a couple of books or articles I saw which did decide to focus on these intersections for, say, gender or disability tended to actually be about smaller communities. So, for example, is it Olivia Sandler? Yeah, she wrote a thesis in 1990 which looked at race and gender in the Leeds Jewish community and looked at the clothing industry and the way that women's positions were different from Jewish men and from non-Jewish men and from non-Jewish women. Really interesting, and I think by having that smaller case study in Leeds actually helped her present a bit more of a nuanced case. Because if you're taking a much bigger view of a much bigger community, you end up, you can't cover all the minor details and the nuances in the same way. So I think there's a practical and there's a methodological reason to focus on Leeds. Now, one thing I did notice in my research was that with the nature of doing something like this, it very much depends on what you can find. If I can't find anything on disabled people, then I can't do the research. And in a way, part of me wonders if by focusing just on Leeds, I actually limited my research somewhat. As I said, I'll go through my process. You can feed back to me if I did or not. We can make it interactive. But the kind of what I thought, what I'll get to towards the end, is that actually doing comparative research by comparing between communities, you actually get an interesting sense of where the community overall was at and also some of the nuances within different communities as well. So in terms of the sources I used for the research, it kind of went all over the place. I wanted at first to really focus on narratives of Jewish people from that time period. In race history, which is what I did for my MA, there's a really big focus on getting first-hand narratives from Americans, from Native Americans, from any kind of group, because of having a random person who's not part of that group representing their histories and their stories. You want to get someone actually from that background. And so I wanted to find a Jewish case study of that from this time period, and unfortunately I just couldn't find it, which probably says a lot of the way I kind of assumed there would just be historical sources just lying around. There are some non-Jewish narratives of disability in this industrial period. I am blanking on his name. I think it was William Dodd. In 1838, he published a book about how he was impaired from working within, I think it was a pin factory, just because of the types of machines they used. He suffered lots of lifelong injuries because of it. And I saw this and I thought, there's definitely going to be something about the Jewish community. The high rates of industrialization, of Jews working in the clothing industry, of the poor sanitary conditions they lived in. There's 100% going to be something. But as far as I could find, I couldn't see anything. There might be somewhere, maybe in someone's attic, or maybe in some buried box somewhere, but I personally couldn't find anything. So I ended up going through different source types to find the narrative I wanted to tell. So the main one I used was the board reports from the Jewish Board of Guardians in Leeds. These were really useful just because it gave me a good idea of what kind of welfare existed for Jewish people at the time, and it gives you an insight to how the community changes and what challenges they faced over different time periods. But I also used oral archives from the Manchester Jewish Museum. In the Porton Gallery collection in the University of Leeds, there's actually loads of books and manuscripts and anything and everything related to Jews from this time period. And I use a lot of those, which is a really interesting collection if you haven't had the chance to look at it. And I also use the JC's newspaper. They have a really good archive. I don't get the impression it's used much, but it's a pretty good online collection. So. And then the other big one I used were kind of unpublished secondary sources. So this was actually lent to me by the Leeds Jewish Welfare Board, which obviously in the past were the Leeds Jewish Board of Guardians. It's by Heinz Skite, and it's a lovely view of welfare in the Leeds Jewish community. But he doesn't use any citations, any sources. He doesn't publish it in any kind of historical way, which makes it difficult to use in a historical piece of work because you kind of need to reference everything that you do. And he actually noticed that part of the issue with this was because things weren't recorded, things weren't preserved, and that he ended up presenting it more as a loose narrative as opposed to an academic work because of this lack of citation. But I thought it would still be useful to use, especially so much of the information actually corroborated with stuff I saw in other historically verified sources. So I thought, I can use it, and my supervisor let me treat it as a primary source, but write about it in a secondary way, which is a bit weird, but it worked. So. And in terms of the archives, again, these are all over the place. A lot of them in Leeds, like the Leeds Jewish Welfare Board, the Leeds City Library. I ended up using the Manchester Jewish Museum, and you'll learn why towards the end. They're, again, fantastic collection. Highly recommend if you're interested just in Anglo-Jewish history, if you haven't looked at it. Obviously, McCall, which is in the same building as the Leeds Jewish Welfare Board, they have a great cultural archive. And then, weirdly, the London Metropolitan Archive had a bunch of board reports that I used. I don't know why. So as I said, my original focus was going to be looking at Jews in industry. Because, again, I would read narratives of the awful sanitary conditions that Jews would live in and the sweatshop conditions that the clothing industry took place in. And I thought, this is definitely going to have a big narrative of impairment, of disablement. But I found that, again, it was difficult to find the primary sources on the topic. And so when I kind of did my final write-up, I changed the emphasis. What I did find, however, is that there's a lot of links to anti-Semitism and immigration at this time, which I think are actually quite interesting to explore. So, again, I'm going to go through some of this a little bit. I'm sure you all know more about the history of the community than I do, so I'm going to put a very, very general narrative. But I'm going to explore the anti-Semitism and immigration a little bit before I actually get onto the Board of Guardians and. So there's history of Leeds, Jews being in Leeds from the early 1800s. I believe there's a gravestone that was found from 1820, which was kind of seen as the first evidence of Jewish community in Leeds. But then also there was a Jewish cemetery in 1837, and slowly more and more evidence of the community became apparent from that time. And it's important to think about it from the pre-immigration period, because obviously Jews came over, whether that was from other cities in the UK after they were allowed back in, or it was from earlier waves of immigration. But these earlier Jews were able to set up good lives for themselves, able to come. They worked as peddlers and able to become quite profitable in their work. So eventually, when these later waves of immigration came in the late 1880s onwards, there was an established kind of Jewish middle class that could interact with these poor working class immigrants. Studies from Katrina Honeyman and Joseph Stern and Joseph Buckman really talk about this idea of Jewish immigration and them being the driving workforce behind the Leeds Jewish community and their place in Leeds as an industry. Leeds has always been known for its woolen trades. I think, again, I read a source which was talking about it, kind of Leeds woolen trade from the 13th century. And there was some very funny story about apparently immigrants had come over on the boats. They would talk about Leeds as this ethereal, magical place where they could all have wonderful amounts of work. But so Leeds was very much seen as a industrial hub for the clothing industry, and these authors all place Jews as a driving factor behind its growth and its development, primarily because they provided a constant supply of cheap labour, but also relatively skilled. So a lot of the professions they would use back in the Pale of Settlement would draw on some of the skills in the clothing industry. And it tied into an existing market of Jews, factories providing uniforms for the army. And so kind of all these factors came in together to cause an explosion in what was the Leeds Jewish community. Now, in terms of the kind of setup of the factories, as far as I can understand it, because again I might be misinterpreting it somewhat, the way I understand it is that majority non-Jewish factory owners would have these big establishments full of workers, and they would take in a certain amount of work, and they would do part of the work in the factory. So if they were making a suit jacket, they would do the majority of the cutting and the stitching, but then they would have workshops where they would send over the rest of the materials and use that as finishing areas. So they could take on more work, but still they wouldn't have to hire more workers to actually finish the products they started making. So these workshops ended up being filled with Jewish workers. And they tended to be people that would finish seams, they would put on buttons, and it was very much a work environment which was it was intended only for immigrant workers. It wasn't necessarily the kind of promised land of work that Jewish immigrants thought they were getting into. These workshops were often referred to as sweatshops because they were very unhygienic. They had very poor sanitary conditions, poor lighting, poor ventilation. And as I said, it was part of the reason why I actually wanted to look at disability in the community in the first place. There's a book by Todd Endelman, which again is a very generic narrative of Anglo-Jewish history. It's the 1556 to 2000. And he specifically points out Leeds as not only an example of the awful sanitary conditions that the Jewish immigrants were living in this time, but also specific impairments. He would talk about how poor ventilation caused respiratory issues, and how poor eyesight, poor lighting conditions caused sight issues, which didn't lead to complete blindness, but would still affect later life and be a lifelong ailment. And so, these workshops were very, very unhygienic, and as I said, they were lifelong issues. They were partially also problematic because a lot of the areas the workshops were in would have been the same places they lived. While the size and scope does vary between workshops, I think I saw one report which talked about how they were workshops as big as 50 people per workshop, and one which was as small as 2. So there's a huge variation between them. But they tended to be in the living areas that Jewish families would live in, so where their front rooms, or where they slept, where they cooked, prepared food, where they washed. So all of these issues in terms of ventilation, in terms of hygiene, would also feed back into the living conditions. If you think about something like tuberculosis, as far as I know, it's airborne, and it can be passed quite easily through fluid. If you're sharing plates, if you're sharing dishes, if you're sharing your sleeping areas, your washing areas, also in the same place as all these workers, disease was quite common, things were transferred quite easily. And there was a lot of crackdown on the sweatshops by the government, various sanitary commissions from, I think, the mid-1880s onwards, but it kind of didn't stop. They would always, as soon as one would be quashed, 2 more would come back up, and the issues, say the lack of toilets, wouldn't necessarily be addressed. So it was quite a dire situation, and it's interesting how quickly the community actually managed to better itself and move into the slightly nicer areas as the community goes more north into where we are now. Because there's like a 30-year period where it's like night and day for the majority of Jews there. So so as I mentioned, I think anti-Semitism is actually a really important thing to talk about here, and it will feed into a bit later when I talk about the Leeds Jewish Border Guardians. One thing I noticed was when using things from Porting collection is that so much anti-Semitism from this time was based on not only eugenic thinking, but was also based on ideas of health, ideas of infection, and ideas of impairment. There's a book by this guy called Joseph Bannister called England Under the Jews, which kind of gives you an idea of what it's about. And it was published in 1901 or 1903, and it had this weird hodgepodge of anti-Semitic stereotypes ranging from religious ideas to the idea of Jews being dirty, of Jews being immigrants, of being physically and genetically different, but then also interesting racial ideas about Jews being yellow-skinned, Jews being Oriental. So it's beside by how angry it made me, it's actually really interesting because again, this is at the height of a lot of prejudice towards immigrants, at the height of a lot of this eugenic racial anti-Semitism. So to see all these ideas kind of combined together, it's interesting. But so people at Joseph Bannister very much linked Jewish immigrants to the declining genetic stock of Britain. One example that he uses is this idea that Jews would come over, well, he said immigrants, but Jews would come over, and they would carry infections. Those infections would spread to British children, again, British, not necessarily non-Jewish, and those infections would cause impairment. So the example he uses is trachoma. It's an infection which affects the eyeball, and eventually, I believe it's something to do with skin growths, which would then lead to a loss of sight. So this idea that by having immigrants come into the country, they're physically causing physical impairments to take place, which I thought was a fascinating idea. Obviously, again, depressing and sad and anti-Semitic, but also interesting. Jewish immigration increased very steadily from the 1870s, 1880s, but by the early 1900s it was at peak levels, and in 1905 they passed the Anti-Aliens Act, which would, in theory anyway, halt Jewish immigration from taking place into the UK. Whether that actually happened, I think, is, as far as I can tell, it's up to historical debate, because I think there's some evidence say that it did stop immigration, some evidence say that it didn't. But I didn't really focus on that end of it so much, to be honest. So I don't know a huge amount about it. But yeah, having this impoverished state of the Jewish community really confirmed anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant rhetoric. Again, there's other narratives, other examples of people talking about scalp disease in the Jewish community, which I don't really know what they were referring to there. Part of me thought maybe linked to Kippur. I don't really know. But yeah, so this idea that the Jewish community not only, were seen as, and there actually was a lot of health issues in the community, but there were visible markers of infection, of impairment, of difference between kind of the good genetic stock, the British stock, and the kind of filthy Jewish stock. And I think there's also a link between, you think about the class system in Britain, and under kind of the poor law at that time, and under the economic conditions that the Jewish immigrants would live in, there's very much an idea of the dirty, poor immigrant, the idea of the people coming over and having to scrounge off the state, which, again, you see a little bit today. And it ties into the anti-Semitic ideas, and you can see how a lot of ideas towards anti-Semitism, around classism, around infection, impairment, they kind of all can combine together into just a generic anti-immigrant rhetoric. Now, one thing I didn't address, which I probably should have, but I structured the talk in this way, is that I haven't specifically defined how I'm talking about disability. The way we define disability is a big political issue. It very much changes throughout the centuries, and the language that's used to define a disabled person or an impairment, a disability, is completely different in this period than it would be now. So a lot of the language they would use in that time would be like feeble-minded. Feeble-minded in referring to someone with some form of psychological difference or mental illness, behavioural issue, learning disability. But it can even be used to refer to people with alcoholism, with addiction issues. So it's a very generic word for a time period they didn't really understand a lot of the medical differences and behavioural differences between different impairments. So because of that, I deliberately didn't try to define what I was talking about when I say disability, because it doesn't necessarily actually fit into what our modern language doesn't necessarily fit into the historical language. Again, also practical reason, I didn't know what I was going to find, so I thought I'd be a really broad picture, and then anything that seems irrelevant I can use. So, but again, as I say, there's a big political part behind this, and it's interesting seeing, so the examples I'll talk about later, disability now is very much seen as a political identity. Someone is a disabled person, they are disabled by the society they live in. That's the social model of disability. Those ideas weren't around in that time period. And kind of the welfare systems very much underpin the idea of dependence, of disabled people being dependent on others for support for their own, they didn't have independence. So as I promised, the talk would be about Jewish welfare. And one thing that I noted straight off the bat was that when I saw kind of any evidence of statistics of people in workhouses, which I'll explain in a second, there weren't really a lot of Jewish people in there. Now, it is a bit tricky because some of the evidence I saw was people verbally describing statistics as opposed to actually showing a table. This is a table from Brendan McGowan's book about the Irish community in Leeds. And you can see, so the majority of people in the workhouses were of English or Irish descent, some of Scottish, but then you have Poland and elsewhere as maybe 1%. Oh yeah, so in the birthplace of inmates, this is a workhouse in 1881 on Beckett Street. Of England, 37% of inmates, it's like 73% of inmates were from England, 24% were from Ireland, 1.6% were from Scotland, 0.2% from Poland, and 0.6% from elsewhere. Now, I kind of interpreted Poland as potentially it could be a Jewish person. It might not be, because obviously we're non-Jewish Polish immigrants, but you never know. Also, elsewhere is interesting because it might have been, say, a village in Russia, a village in Poland that didn't necessarily have those national ties. A lot of evidence from, say like census documents would have people write Russian and cross it out because they didn't necessarily they wanted to assimilate into the country. So the idea of elsewhere is interesting to me. But the point of this is that it shows that even if Poland and elsewhere were all Jews, that's still only 4 people of a population of over 400 in this workhouse. which implies that there weren't necessarily a lot of Jews in the workhouse, if there were any there at all. Now, the workhouse, as you may or may not know, this was a system of welfare which existed after the New Poor Law in the 1840s, and the way the workhouses worked is they were built on this idea that poor people were lazy. And the only reason that they were poor was because they just couldn't be bothered to work, they couldn't be bothered to get out and get a real job. So the idea of the workhouse, it was a place where they would be forced to work for their meals and for their accommodation. And by doing so, in these awful conditions, in these very demoralising environment, they would want to become useful, independent citizens, which obviously doesn't really work if you're someone with a disability who can't necessarily hold down a job, who can't use physical machineries in lots of factories, potentially has behavioural issues. It doesn't accommodate for those kind of differences, but that isn't the ideology that came behind the workhouses. And so it's interesting that there's not necessarily a Jewish connection to the workhouses there. Now, as I'm going to argue that, and actually as Malcolm suggested when we had dinner before, which was lovely by the way, that actually there was a very deliberate, conscious effort by the community to not be supported by the state. The community wanted to support itself, to not present itself as dependent. And actually, in some ways, it actually reflects some of the rhetoric that went into the workhouses, this idea that you shouldn't be dependent, you shouldn't take from the state, and you should be self-sufficient. As a sidebar, just because I find it really interesting, there's a book by Simon Fowler on the workhouses. Again, if you're interested, it's a really interesting book. And one thing that he mentions is this idea that actually there's a lot of class in the workhouses and how that affected who was designated as disabled. So you could be a able-bodied, i.e. a non-disabled person in the workhouses, but because of the social parameters that surrounded the workhouses, you would be considered a disabled person, an impaired person, because you weren't seen as worthy of support, you weren't seen as worthy of working. You were seen as lazy, and that effectively made you disabled by the society you live in. So, in a way, you had a kind of an economic class of disabled people, which doesn't really sound logical, but in this kind of, again, very class-based, very eugenic environment, it actually makes a lot of sense, especially if you're thinking about kind of who was worthy of support and who was allowed to be self-sufficient, who wasn't self-sufficient in these economic systems. So yeah, just a bit of a sidebar. So Jewish welfare. So the Jewish community has a history of welfare, especially of supporting immigrants to the country. And there's plenty of examples of this outside of Leeds. You think about, say, kinder transport, when Jewish refugees would come over and the community would establish, plenty of provisions for them. You think about actually the early Sephardic period. My girlfriend's actually writing a dissertation on that, and one thing she notes is that one of the first things they established was a welfare institution to help other immigrants. You go back to like the ghettos in Venice and into the Middle Ages, and again, it's all the same things. The Jews are very dependent on systems of welfare within the community. And again, I'm sure there's a religious link to tzedakah or some kind of high spirituality, but from a very cynical point of view, I feel like you can argue that this is also a way for the community to protect itself, for the community to avoid a lot of anti-Semitic abuse from outside organisations, and also a way for the community to present a certain image of itself. It's the way for the community to decide who they're going to support, how they're going to shape minds and behaviours, and again, create the community that they want the rest of society to see, which I know sounds very scary, but it's not how I'm intending it. So the Jewish Board of Guardians, they were kind of based off the regular Board of Guardian system that was introduced in the Poor Law, again in the kind of mid-1840s, sometime around there. But by the name, they're Jewish, they go specifically for the Jewish community. The earliest one was established in London in 1859, and after that a couple popped up elsewhere, and eventually every Jewish community had their own, regardless of how big or small it was. I believe the order goes something like London, Liverpool, Manchester, and then Leeds. I might be wrong on that. To be honest, there's actually not a lot of information about the Board of Guardians. There's not much written about them, which made it very exciting from a historical perspective to research, but also made it really annoying because there's nothing written on them. In Leeds, there was actually a system of welfare already, which was introduced by the Belgrave Street Synagogue. And what they did was that they basically would just give out sums of money to immigrants that needed support. What they would use the money for isn't necessarily clear. Again, there's not a lot written about it. My impression would be it was so people could buy supplies, they could buy accommodation, and in some sense actually set up their own businesses. But generally it was just giving out sums of money. And in 1878, they decided to actually create a separate institution, the Leeds Jewish Board of Guardians, which Paul Hirsch was its first president. Paul Hirsch was actually one of the board members of the Belgrave Street Synagogue, and I believe he was in charge of the welfare. So it's very much, it comes from a community-wide institution, and it became its own organisation as part of it. I don't know how, as a sidebar, I don't know if actually but there were a lot of links between the different Board of Guardians. I assume not, but I don't really know actually. It's an interesting point because they very much actually copy each other in terms of the kind of support they offer, the kind of supplies they would give to people, the kind of loans they would give to people. So these are two board reports I found. So this is from the Leeds Central Library, and this is from 1894. And the second one on the right is by the West Yorkshire Archive, found in West Yorkshire Archive from 1928. So there's about 34 years of difference in this. I didn't realise how small the text was going to be, so I'll read it out a little bit. So in terms of the 1894 report, in terms of what they would support, you can see there's Passover relief to resident poor, about 1,300 persons. They would give away blankets. They said printing, including Passover tickets, which I don't really know what that means. They'd give loans. There were expenses for various board members. And the big one, the most money came to, was coals to resident poor. So, giving supplies of coal to poor families so they could have some warmth. And temporary assistance to resident poor, expense of sending families away, and casual relief. So very much in this period, the goal of the board was to support poor people, to support poor families, also in religious contexts, give food out and Passover, but generally it was to just support their ability to live and thrive in this new country. We go over to the 1828 one, which there's a lot of numbers, and I'm dyslexic, so you can see it changes. There's a lot of the same stuff. There's special relief, there's resident temporary relief, casual relief, coal, there's I think this one says hallway fares, which again I'm assuming is some kind of restoration, but again, a lot of the same stuff. But further down, you've got money to the Harrogate Hospital, money to a convalescent home, another hospital in Harrogate, Leeds Public Dispensary, the Herzl Moshe Hospital, which was a Jewish hospital in Leeds, which again, as we talked about, there isn't also a lot written on that. And interestingly, the Jewish Deaf and Dumb Home in London. So you can see the way the Board of Guardians supports the community radically changes in this time period. They weren't focused just on providing financial relief, on providing loans and providing supplies, but it was also on supporting those in need, supporting those with welfare needs. There's also for the NSPCC, so they were also supporting non-Jewish charities as well as Jewish organisations. What's also interesting is you can see there's also a big, they list everything, and it's like printing costs and postage costs, and there's also a big thing about trains. They seem to send a lot of people places, and I kind of argued in my dissertation that there's some vague idea about, again, the idea of keeping up appearances. They would want to send immigrants that necessarily fit their community to other areas. Again, there's especially in the other Board of Guardians reports I found from areas like Hull, Glasgow, Sheffield, that all their money goes to sending people elsewhere. Which part of me thinks maybe they just didn't have the means to support them. Maybe again now this kind of eugenic idea, this kind of social idea of how we want to present ourselves by having an overabundance of poor people, of people begging. Maybe it was a way to limit that anti-Semitism. I don't want to make too outlandish claims, so that's for your interpretation. So the most interesting one I found, at least for my purposes, was from 1899 to 1900. This I found in the London Metropolitan Archives, again of all places, they have it in London instead of Leeds. And again, it's a lot of the same stuff in terms of loans and blankets and boots and this kind of stuff. But one thing they point out, that in expensive condition with a special case, 2 artificial legs of £24, and relief granted for convalescence, which would be about £11 and 4 shillings. About £35 and 4 shillings in today's money, if I remember rightly, I think it's about £4,000, £5,000, which is a lot, and especially considering this is for one person, the majority of their support went to, they would buy sums of coal and they could give it out to a lot of people. This was £4,000, £5,000 for one person. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of information about who and why and anything else, but it implies that they were willing to support disabled people and to give them the assistive technology they needed. But yeah, the idea of this being a special case is quite interesting to me because it implies that, well, this isn't what they normally did. And as we saw from the previous board examples, they actually didn't, their support didn't really encapsulate this kind of equipment regularly. And so the idea of the special case really stuck with me. When I was researching, I kind of, again, this idea of the special case really stuck with me because I think it implies a couple of different things. You can interpret it as there was this one case of a Jewish guy who just really needed some legs, and they wanted to help him out. And I think, again, thinking about the ways the welfare systems would support Jewish people, that's a lovely sentiment. But that also implies there weren't a lot of disabled people in the Jewish community at the time. And there are some arguments for that. There's a book or an article anyway by Deborah Dorr, and she argues that so basically the boats that would bring Jewish immigrants over from Russia and Poland and Eastern Europe that would go to Britain and America, they would check the immigrants that came over for any diseases or impairments before they came. She gives an example of a family of 8. They're all allowed on except for the girl who's writing the narrative because she has the beginnings of trachoma in one of her eyes. And says, you're going to become blind at some point, even though she could be treated, but fine, she's going to become blind at some point. So you're not allowed on. You're not allowed to come to Britain or America. And I think there's this idea that, well, maybe the community didn't have disabled people because in this early period, well, it was mostly made up of fresh immigrants. None of them would have been disabled because they all stopped from getting on the boats. Which I argued for a little bit, but I don't necessarily wish they mentioned as wheelchair bound for the rest of their life. So it's, that interpretation doesn't necessarily fit. But then also, again, it implies the idea that disability is a static thing. Is that if you're able-bodied, you will always be able-bodied, and that's that. Which isn't really how the human body works. And even though a young 18-year-old from Bialystok could come over and settle in Leeds, that doesn't mean they were always going to be able-bodied. And using the examples I used before from the factories and from the living conditions, Britain wasn't any more hygienic than those boats or from the conditions in Russia or from Poland or wherever. So again, this idea that disability is a static thing, I don't think really works in that context. And then obviously you've got things like the First World War, huge amounts of impairment, both physical and psychological, from the First World War. Again, I couldn't find a huge amount of evidence of specific cases, but the JC, in their archive, they actually have this lovely little article about unemployment after the First World War and how there were these disabled men, veterans, who couldn't find jobs, about how they need to be supported. They would gather in the Leeds trade union building. I can't remember which street, it's off my head, but they would gather in this building, they would talk about their employment issues, because obviously they were a trade union. But this idea that the Jewish community was somehow divorced from the rest of, from the experience of impairment and from the rest of the country doesn't really hold, in my opinion. So, yeah, and one thing I noted is that the majority of instances of impairment that I could find were physical. So there's the example of the guy who needed artificial legs. In this lovely little book, Heinz Geit notes that in 1917 there was a guy who needed an artificial arm, and he specifically refers to it as a hook hand, but it's an artificial hand. And there was also another case of a woman with polio, which obviously which when it was treated would leave a lot of people wheelchair bound, and another case of someone who had blindness. She was blind, then she became mute. I believe that's how it went. So again, these are all impairments which were physical in nature, they were visible in nature, and it could be seen either at a distance or up close. I feel a little uncomfortable arguing this, but what I kind of came to in my argument was that the reason that these impairments were supported is because they were impairments which could be corrected or normalised in some way. This idea that by giving someone an artificial leg, they could appear as a regular able-bodied person, and in that sense, it would tie into that idea of the Jewish community trying to appear normal and trying to assimilate into British society. Which, again, it sounds a bit damning and it sounds very weird in some ways, but there's actually some evidence in the kind of later historical period, which I'm studying now for my PhD, of that happening in the sports world, of people resisting accessible technologies because in a way it normalised them. And think about that political identity of a disabled person. By, in a way, taking that away, it takes away that identity factor, which is an interpretation, and I'm sure the majority of people don't agree with it. But I think it's an interesting idea when it's tying into the eugenic systems of this time period, into the systems of, the visual nature of how people were ranked. A lot of eugenic science was based around how people looked, size of skulls and that kind of stuff, and colour of eyes. So there's also another idea that could reinforce this. So again, in this book, Heinz Geigt talks a lot about how those with psychological impairments, those with behavioural differences, of learning difficulties, or sometimes even of completely things that aren't even related to disability. He talks about girls who are misbehaving and talking about sexual endeavours, like nothing to do with disability, but okay. And these ideas that they would be taken to asylums or insane houses to correct them or to remove them from society. And again, there's an argument that, well, these are better for disabled people because it gave them dedicated care and support, but it also very much removed them from the community. There's a really interesting oral history from a guy called Paul Sutton in the Manchester Jewish Museum, and he worked with a lot of older disabled people in these care homes who came from institutions, and they would talk about how the community, once they were taken to these asylums, they were just forgotten about. They weren't part of the community anymore, and they very much lost their Jewish identity, both religiously and culturally, because they were effectively divorced from the community completely. He also mentions a specific Jewish instance of ableism in the system of arranged marriages that would exist in a lot of Ashkenazi Orthodox families. The idea of having, if I had a sibling who had some form of autism, say, some behavioural issue, that would be like a black mark on my family's bloodline. So then I would be less likely to be married off to another family. I would be seen as not as valuable in terms of making children and whatnot. Again, I'm trying not to use genetic language because it didn't entirely come from that context. But, so I think there's a willingness in some parts of the community to necessarily hide disabled people, Jewish disabled people, because they didn't necessarily fit the image that they were trying to promote to the non-Jewish society, and also the image within the community of the idea of us being being regular people, of not conforming to the anti-Semitic tropes that someone like Joseph Buckman would iterate. Again, I think it is a little damning of the community, and I do not intend it to be that way, but I think it's interesting and important to think about the intersectional nature of this kind of research. Identities don't exist within vacuums. I am Jewish, I am disabled, I am a man, I am whatever else. But as you might be able to argue, all of that, even though I use evidence from Leeds and Manchester, it doesn't actually tell us anything about the Jewish community in Leeds in particular. That kind of argument, that kind of logic could be used between communities. It doesn't pick out anything from Leeds in particular. And so I thought, I'm doing this regional history, I might as well compare it to another nearby community, because I'm running out of words and I need to figure out how to extend this to my word count. But seriously though, it was from a methodological point of view, because I thought it would be interesting to see, actually, was this just in Leeds, or was this the case in other communities as well? So I ended up looking at Manchester because I was using the Manchester Jewish Museum anyway, and I thought, why not? I'm here. Manchester Jewish community and the Leeds Jewish community are similar in lots of different ways, especially in this time period. They both lived in similar parts of their respective cities. As far as I know, their population size were relatively similar. I believe Manchester was still bigger at this time, but Leeds was also huge. So I don't know the figures enough to confirm that. They were in similar industries. The Leeds industry was a lot more in terms of ready-made clothing, so suits. Think about Burton's factory, think about Marks and Spencer. It was very much ready-made suits and shirts and that kind of stuff. The Manchester community, I believe, were more focused on coats. So I think apparently the raincoat was a big thing, as far as I know. Again, I didn't focus on them too much. But the key difference is they actually had more welfare institutions for disabled Jews. There was a home called an organisation called the Manchester Jewish Home for Aged, Sick and Incurables, which kind of split off into, had the aged and sick home and then the incurables home. And it suggests a couple of things. One, that the community were either more willing, more able, or had more people to provide a separate welfare institution for. They had a Jewish Board of Guardians in Manchester, but that was used almost primarily for its its financial support for it, providing coal and loans, and this institution was used specifically for the care of elderly, the care of the sick, and the care of the disabled. It also implies, however, again, think about language, this idea of the incurable. So again, think about disabled people, think about disability politics. Disability is an identity in the same way that being Jewish is an identity or being a woman is an identity. And so to imply that it's a medical condition that can be cured or should be cured is problematic in certain ways. I know there's various debates and etc., but the term incurable is quite interesting because it implies that it was like, well, these are the people that we can't help, so we'll just stick them in a home. But still, it's more dedicated welfare than the Leeds community have, so points, I guess. There's an opening of the Jewish Home for Incurables. I believe this is in 1920. It's not dated, but the curator I spoke to, she thought it was around that time, so I'm going to believe her. And then this is a view of the inside. Basically, it's just a row of beds. There's a lot of lighting in there. They're spaced quite apart, so there's space for wheelchairs to go in and out, space for equipment to go in and out, but also it's open plan, so they can still talk to one another. Nurses can still walk up and down, so it's quite nice. It's better than just being an institution where you're locked in a cell by yourself. One thing I found really interesting that I found was an application form. So in this application form, it basically tells us who they would accept for support and who they wouldn't accept for support. I'll read it out. So it says, persons of the Jewish faith, resident in Manchester area for no less than 5 years, so they can't be immigrants, they have to be Jewish, who have attained the age of 16 years, can't be children, and who are permanently disabled by chronic disease, accident, or deformity. So again, it's tying into that idea that it was about physical impairment. Thinking about chronic disease, accident, or deformity, those usually imply physical ailments in terms of spinal injuries, in terms of losing limbs, in terms of using use of motor control, in terms of again, facial disfigurements. These are all physical markers. Now, chronic disease and accident could also lead to non-visible disabilities, but later on they say cases of epilepsy, insanity, idiocy, tuberculosis, and infection are ineligible. So again, it implies this idea that they would treat the physical markers of disability, not necessarily non-physical markers. Again, insanity and idiocy are very generic terms for mental illness and behavioural differences. Epilepsy is more of a symptom than an issue within itself, I think, anyway. So I don't know, they've put that out, which is interesting. And then also tuberculosis and infection. So again, this idea that infection and illnesses weren't necessarily separate from impairments and disabilities as they would be considered nowadays. If you had infection like trachoma, there was like 9 out of 10 people would end up having an impairment because of it. There wasn't as much healthcare as we have nowadays. Technology wasn't as good. Understanding of the diseases themselves weren't as sufficient. So they're all kind of lumped together into this vague category. It could also imply that tuberculosis was quite common in the community at this time, which also makes a lot of sense. So they weren't going to shell out money to everyone who had tuberculosis, because then they would be paying for almost everyone. Now, this is from the 1930s, so it's a little later than my time period. There's no specific date given. It literally ends with, signed in 1903, and then a blank space when you could put in the year. But yeah, so this is very interesting. It tells us a lot about who they would support, who they wouldn't support. So to conclude, I kind of ended on this idea that the idea of physical markers of disability being corrected and psychological being kind of removed or shunned kind of does apply across communities. You can see a lot of the same stuff in Leeds that you can see in Manchester, and I would assume elsewhere. I haven't done that research, so I don't want to make that claim just yet. But there are still important differences between those communities, so thinking about those regional variations are quite important. So we don't want to present a blanket view of Anglo-Jewry. The research ties together disability history, Jewish history, industrial history, and healthcare history, which, again, in academia they're seen as disparate fields, but especially thinking about Jewish and industrial history, disability and healthcare histories, industrial and disability histories, they're all interconnected. And I think by having narratives that don't address those intersections is actually quite damaging to the research itself. To consider the community in lots of different ways is important to understand the community as a whole. I had a lot of issues in the research in terms of finding sources, in terms of presenting a narrative which wasn't too confusing. I apologise if it was. And just generally finding an argument which highlighted differences in the Jewish community without damning the community too much. And I think there's a lot more to do in this area, and I hope if I do get the time to do more research into it, I'd be able to address those concerns somewhat and create a bit more of a more nuanced view. The nature of the MA being very time constrained and having the limited word count, and also just money to travel and do stuff. I didn't get to do as much research into the other elements of the topic that I would have done. I think in the future I'd focus just on the Board of Guardians and the welfare angles. I'd probably cut a lot of the industry stuff. And as I said at the start, locating primary sources is one of the hardest parts of this, not only this era of history in general, about the Jewish, so much is lost in the Jewish community of this time period. Malcolm was telling me that there was a house and they just threw everything out when it was bought by someone else. So, yeah. But then also, in thinking about disability history, is thinking about whose voices are valued, whose voices are recorded, and how they're recorded. Now we're able to do oral histories, which my PhD is actually going to do, which is going to be lovely. But in this time period, they wouldn't have that. It would all be written narratives, and it was about would they be recorded in the first place, and if so, would they be preserved, and would they be seen as worth preserving? And so I think it's an inherent issue with this kind of research, but it doesn't mean it's insurmountable, and there are still ways to pull out these narratives, without necessarily presenting a very generalised, homogenous view of disabled people, Jewish people, or whoever else. I just have a list of sources. So at the top, I've got what I use in terms of the pictures, and then at the bottom, just if you're interested, this is some of the readings I found most useful. Again, as mentioned, Sinophile book on workhouses is very interesting if you're interested into this topic anymore. So yeah, thank you very much.
This is your Leeds Jewish station, Radio JCOM. Radio JCOM.